I'm James Miranda.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 15. Stunned. Annapolis Junction, Maryland. It was a cloudy morning. The sun had been unable to burn its way through the thick overcast that threatened the city with snow. Colonel Zaitsev of Spetsgruppe A smiled. It was the perfect weather for what they were about to do today. There was really no better way to impair the abilities of an aerial search party. As they drove down the parkway in his Chevy Suburban with blacked-out windows, Zaitsev made sure to stay approximately 3 vehicles behind their blacked-out 30-passenger bus. He checked his rearview mirror. Their second Suburban was still a few cars back, ready to act as their backup should they need it. "What do we do if the Americans have a checkpoint at the business park?" asked Lieutenant Connican nervously. He scanned outside the passenger window continuously for any possible threats. Casually turning to look at the young officer, Zaitsev saw that Connican's anxiety was increasing with each passing moment. His hand was fidgeting with his AK-15K assault rifle. This was his first real mission with them, and it was showing. Zaitsev shook his head slightly as he returned his gaze to the traffic on the road and the passenger bus they were following. "Lieutenant, you worry too much," he said nonchalantly. "Please calm yourself. You're going to miss things happening around us if you're too edgy. We have driven this route several times. The Americans have never had a checkpoint to enter the business park, and they will not have one today. Just make sure you don't forget to monitor the business park for electronic jammers that might interfere with the remote detonator." "Da," Connican replied. He resumed his vigilant gaze out the passenger side window. It was now 0928 hours. They were catching the tail end of the morning commute, so the traffic was relatively light compared to what it would have been 90 minutes earlier. When Zaitsev saw the sign for Jessup Road, he turned his blinker light on and pulled onto the off-ramp, following the bus as it did the same. As they left the parkway, they seamlessly slid into the remains of the morning commuters and drove the short distance to the intersection of Jessup and National Business Parkway. As they stopped at the red light, Zaitsev reached down and grabbed the black balaclava mask and put it on the top of his head, ready to pull down and cover his face when the time came. When the light turned green, Lieutenant Connican also placed his balaclava on his head. After their vehicle passed the large blue water tower on the left-hand side of the road, they entered the traffic circle and headed down the home stretch to their target. At this point, Colonel Zaitsev turned to his nervous partner. "See? I told you. No checkpoints," he said. The young officer sighed, and then he seemed to calm down a bit. After they rounded a bend in the road, they saw a cluster of 3 to 8-story tall office buildings, intermixed with trees and parking garages for the army of contractors that worked in these secretive buildings. To the untrained eye, this was just a typical American business park. However, these were no ordinary office buildings. These structures were secured, compartmentalized information facilities that belonged to companies that managed nearly half of the National Security Agency's workload. This army of contractors and government service employees managed the off-site data management, storage, analysis, and intelligence capabilities for America's electronic warriors. The main NSA building sat just across the highway. When the blacked-out passenger bus turned onto NSA Technology Drive, Zaitsev turned to his partner. "Be ready in case there is trouble. When Starshina Dyachenko stops the bus, he will secure the door and get into our vehicle. Then we'll race over to link up with Viper 1. Konnikin nodded, seeming much more prepared for the moment now. Checking his rearview mirror one last time, Zaitsev saw the BMW that carried his 4 other team members pull off to take up position at the next target. Looking back in front of him, the bus slowed down as it approached the pull-off in front of the Eagle Alliance building. There were no large-capacity computer vans or buses ahead of them or behind them, so it looked like they'd be able to make the drop quickly and then get out of there. Starshina Dyachenko, the operator driving the bus, pulled into the specially designed spot and parked. As he turned the vehicle off, Zaitsev pulled his Chevy Suburban just in front of the bus and stopped. He depressed the unlock button on the door just as Dyachenko rounded the front of the bus and jumped into the SUV. Before anyone in the immediate area knew what had just happened, they sped off through the rest of the parking lot as they raced to get in position near the Booz Allen building a couple of blocks away. "When we round the next corner, I want you to detonate the bus," Zaitsev ordered as he continued to hit the accelerator. "We need to get the other buildings to start evacuating their people for the next phase." They whipped past nearby vehicles and the few pedestrians who were still straggling into the office. Zaitsev wanted to put as much distance as possible between them and the bomb they'd just parked. A few more seconds went by before they rounded the next corner, placing one of the large buildings between them and the bus. "It's time," Colonel Zaitsev announced. Starshina Dyachenko had a devilish look on his face. He moved his right thumb over the detonator button and depressed it, almost flinching at what was sure to be the loudest boom he'd ever heard. Unexpectedly, their worst fear came true. The bomb didn't explode. Knowing something had gone drastically wrong, Zaitsev slammed his foot on the brake, causing the Suburban's tires to screech and the front of the vehicle to dive forward. They slid across the asphalt, nearly fishtailing in the process. When the Suburban came to a halt, he turned around to face Dyachenko. "What's going on? Why is it not going off?" he yelled. After frantically hitting the button a couple more times, Dyachenko just shook his head in frustration and confusion. Lieutenant Konnikin pulled a small electronic device out of his pocket and hurriedly turned it on. His eyes went wide as he realized what the problem was. "They have the frequencies jammed. That's why it won't detonate." Turning his wrath on Konnikin, Colonel Zaitsev screamed, "You had one job, Lieutenant! How could you have forgotten to check to make sure the Americans were not jamming the RFID frequencies when we got near the target?" Lieutenant Konnikin hung his head in shame. Had they known the frequencies were being jammed, Dyachenko would have initiated the manual fuse, which would burn down for 3 minutes before detonating the charges within the bus. Not wanting to waste any more time disciplining the inexperienced member of his team, Zaitsev threw the SUV into reverse, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. This threw the vehicle into a rapid, tight turn as he swung the vehicle around so they faced the road they had just raced down. "Starshina, when you get back to the bus, you know you need to go back inside and set the manual fuse. But don't forget to relock the door. We can't afford any more screw-ups," he yelled. He slowed the vehicle down just enough to make the final turn that would bring them back to the bus. The Russian sergeant cursed at the young lieutenant as he readied his own AK-15K, knowing all too well he'd probably end up having to use it in another minute. "I sure hope you haven't screwed up the mission for us," he muttered. As they pulled around the corner, they spotted a federal police vehicle parked behind the bus with its flashing lights on. A couple of police officers were examining the bus when they looked up at them, their eyes wide as they realized the vehicle that had just roared around the corner was heading right for them. Sensing immediate danger, the 2 police officers moved to a defensible position near the open doors of their car and drew their sidearms. Zaitsev saw one of them reach for a radio. Pop, pop, crack! The front windshield of the Suburban took a couple of hits as Zaitsev and Kanakin instinctively ducked a bit to avoid getting hit. When they were maybe 20 meters from the police officers, Zaitsev slammed the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a hard halt. In the blink of an eye, Lieutenant Kanakin was out of the door with his AK-15K in hand. Using the passenger door as a shield, he flicked the safety off and let loose a string of shots at the two cops. His 7.62mm rounds punched right through the driver's side door and the police officer's body armor. While Kanakin was hammering the officer near the driver's side of the vehicle, Colonel Zaitsev fired 3 well-placed shots into the other officer on his side, aiming 2 to the chest and 1 to the head, just as he'd done countless times over his 28 years in the Russian Special Forces. Yatchenko darted past them and ran up to the bus. He fumbled with his keys for a second as he found the right one and proceeded to unlock the bus. He then dashed inside to set the manual fuse. Zaitsev turned to the front entrance of the building nearest the bus, just in time to see half a dozen armed security guards burst out the front entrance. Moving his rifle to the new threats, the colonel let loose a long burst from his rifle as he attempted to rake as many of them with bullets as possible. The guards all dove for cover behind anything they could, but the barrage still struck a couple of them. Spent shell casings rained to the ground around Zaitsev's feet, clinking and clanking as they hit the pavement. The rapid staccato reports of his rifle barked loudly in comparison to the guards' pistols. The noise echoed off the buildings around them, adding to the chaos of this surreal scene. "Reloading," Zaitsev shouted. He dropped his now empty magazine to the ground and grabbed for a fresh one from his front ammo pouch. He slapped the new magazine in place and charged the bolt, seating the new round in place. "Switching," Kanakin yelled in reply. He advanced around the front hood of the Suburban, then proceeded to empty the rest of his magazine at the security guards to cover Zaitsev while he reloaded. "Reloading," Kanakin then shouted as he dropped his own empty magazine to the ground, essentially swapping positions with his colonel. With a fresh magazine slapped in place, Zaitsev resumed firing on the guards. Ping, crack! Ping, crack! Bullets flew back at them, hitting the Suburban and shattering several of the vehicle's windows. The bullets zipped past Zaitsev's head like angry bees. Dropping to a knee, Zaitsev emptied his second magazine at 3 of the attackers who were trying to bound forward toward him. He hit 2 of them, while the third one ducked behind something and shot back at him. Yatchenko finally finished with the fuse and emerged from the bus. He stopped just long enough to close the door and relock it. Their only hope at this point was to prevent the guards from getting inside long enough for the charges to go off. Yatchenko turned. As he took his first steps back toward his comrades, he was hit by half a dozen bullets from a new set of security guards that had appeared out of nowhere. "Crap, they've flanked us," Zaitsev realized. The colonel grabbed one of the hand grenades from his vest and tossed it toward the group of guards that were hunkered down behind another police vehicle that had pulled forward to help provide them with some cover. "I've got 2 more security vehicles heading in our direction," shouted Kanakin as he fired off a series of shots toward the new targets. The police cruiser swerved and came to a screeching halt 100 meters away from them. The officers got out and returned fire. "We have to get out of here," Zaitsev yelled before uttering a stream of particularly vulgar obscenities. The colonel jumped back into the Suburban, closing the door just as the driver's side window shattered in his face, hitting him with tiny shards of plexiglass. Kanakin also jumped in. Before the lieutenant could even get his door closed, Zaitsev had the SUV in drive and floored it. He sped down the road they had originally started down and raced to link up with the rest of his team, which was currently sitting in the other office park nearby. "Kanakin, keep shooting at them," Zaitsev yelled. He tried to make himself small behind the wheel while still trying to see where he was going. All around them they could hear police sirens, angry shouts in English, gunshots, and the metallic crunching of bullets hitting their vehicle. Suddenly the radio crackled to life in his ear. "Viper 6, what's going on?" asked Major Zlobin, his second in command. "Finally," At least the radios are working, Connican muttered to himself as he swapped out a half-spent magazine with a fresh one. Viper 1, Viper 5 is down, he said, depressing the talk button. They must have had a warlock turned on somewhere near the buildings. The remote detonator wouldn't work, so we had to go back and set the manual charge. Our cover is blown, so go ahead and start the party. We're on our way to your position. Da, came the reply. Zaitsev blew through the intersection as they raced to the next set of office buildings. As he rounded the next corner, he heard the loud ripping of a machine gun opening fire, followed by a small blast. He spotted the Suburban parked in the center of the road and gunned the engine toward them. One of Zaitsev's soldiers had just finished placing another RPG round in his launcher. Zaitsev watched as the man aimed it at another one of the office buildings and fired. The RPG launched itself toward a glass window on the third floor of the nearby building, exploding in spectacular fashion and throwing shrapnel and glass in all directions. Another one of his soldiers had the bipod of his PKP-MG set up on the rear trunk of a car. He proceeded to fire the machine gun rounds into the ground level of one of the adjacent buildings in an attempt to kill as many of the people inside as possible. Zaitsev pulled his Suburban to a halt just to the side of the matching SUV. Colonel Zaitsev and Lieutenant Connican jumped out of their vehicle and joined the fray, shooting up the buildings all around them. They pumped as many rounds into the various buildings as they could, trying to kill or maim as many of the people working inside as possible. Glancing down the block, Zaitsev saw several police cars racing toward their position, when suddenly he heard the loudest explosion of his lifetime. The earth shook, and they all fell to the ground. As he sat on his butt, momentarily dazed, Colonel Zaitsev looked up and saw a massive orange and black fireball growing in the sky. Debris fell back to the ground like rain. As his eyes drifted below, Zaitsev saw that the explosion had been so massive it had blown out all the windows of the buildings and vehicles around them. Zaitsev, who had now fully recovered his senses, yelled to the others, "Time to go. Head to the rally point and let's swap out our vehicles. It's time to get out of here." With that, the soldiers of Spetsgruppe A climbed back into their vehicles and sped out of the corporate park. The men raced down the road at a high rate of speed in the two shot-up SUVs with blown-out windows, jumping onto the Baltimore-Washington Memorial Highway. They rushed along until they came upon the next off-ramp and speedily exited the freeway. Then they pulled into the parking lot of a Total Wine, where the next set of drop vehicles was waiting for them. The 6 surviving Russian Special Forces soldiers jumped out of the 2 Suburbans, grabbing their bags filled with gear, extra magazines, grenades, and other supplies they might need. They swiftly threw the equipment and weapons into the new vehicles. Then Lieutenant Connican and one of the other soldiers pulled the pins on a couple of thermite grenades and tossed them into the shot-up remains of the SUVs, jumping into the new cars and speeding off. In the rearview mirror, Colonel Zaitsev watched as the thermite grenades exploded. They would start an intense fire that would eventually burn the vehicles all the way down to the frame, eliminating any forensic evidence they might have left behind. Now that they had their new rides, they pulled out onto Laurel-Fort Meade Road and headed west. Their next goal was to get out into the countryside of Maryland and the next rally point, where they would once again change out cars before heading off to their safe house to prepare for their next mission. 24 hours later, Washington, D.C., White House, Peacock Bunker. Acting President Luke Powers was typically a calm, mild-mannered man. He seldom lost his cool or even appeared angry in public. But after being stuck in the belly of the Peacock for nearly 4 days, his patience was running thin. The war was now entering its 4th day, and while some aspects of the conflict were finally breaking in their direction, others were not. It was nearly time for the impromptu meeting his generals had called. But before he left his sleeping quarters, Powers wanted to review the intelligence summary of the last few days, to get caught up on all that had transpired. It was almost dizzying to think of how quickly the battle lines had changed. He'd never realized the fluid nature of a complex conflict before. By the end of the second day of the war, the UN forces had captured Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and most of New York. By the end of the third day, they'd captured half of Ohio, all of Michigan, the upper half of Indiana, northern Illinois, and the upper portion of Wisconsin. Yesterday was one of the few bright spots. In the upper Midwest, the UN force had been soundly defeated in a massive running tank battle along the North Dakota-Montana-Canadian border. The battle had gone on for nearly 3 days before it broke decidedly for the Americans. The 4th Infantry Division, which had been deployed to the upper Midwest, had officially crossed into Canada and was even now advancing on Winnipeg. They'd then moved to capture Regina and Calgary as they sought to remove the UN forces in the West and threaten to divide Canada. In Washington state, a joint Canadian-Russian force had been spotted just south of Seattle. Unfortunately, the 2nd Infantry Division lacked the manpower and resources to push them back across the border until additional help could arrive. Sadly, 2 of the National Guard divisions that had been slated to come to their assistance had to be diverted to deal with the uprisings in Oregon and California, the 2 states that had broken from the federal government and were actively working to support the UN force any way they could. In the Southwest, the Chinese continued to marshal their forces in Baja California and the Sonora Desert. While they hadn't crossed the border or engaged the few National Guard and active duty forces along the border, they'd been hitting U.S. forces with a number of cruise missiles, making air operations nearly impossible. However, the primary reasons for the impromptu meeting that would be happening in a few minutes were to discuss the damage assessment from the attack on the NSA yesterday, and to strategize regarding how to respond to the large concentration of Russian, Cuban, and Venezuelan forces being assembled in Cuba. There was a soft knock on Powers's door. Rick, his lead Secret Service agent, announced, "Sir, it's time to head over to the briefing room." The acting president nodded, placed the report on a pad of paper, and took it with him as he stood and exited his private quarters. The 2 of them walked through the hallway in silence. As they made a turn to walk down another identical hall, Luke Powers couldn't help but feel like he had been down in this bunker for weeks. He'd already made 2 televised addresses to the nation from down here. He was starting to feel a bit claustrophobic. However, while he desperately wanted to go back to the residence and show the American people that it was safe to return to work and their daily lives, the Secret Service was having none of it until the Navy felt reasonably sure there were no enemy submarines lurking off the coast of Virginia that could hit the capital with submarine-launched cruise missiles. The country was still reeling from the loss of President Sachs and more than 200 congressional leaders. They couldn't risk losing the vice president as well. As acting President Powers entered the room, the small cadre of military generals and senior advisors all rose. He waved at them to take their seats and made his way to the empty chair at the center of the table, which faced the 2 TV monitors. The outstations were already up and waiting for him. Before he spoke, Powers surveyed the room. The looks of concern were evident on the faces of the men and women before him, but he could also perceive their determination and strength. He looked up at the monitor that displayed the feed from NORAD. "General Tibbets, what's the damage report from the NSA?" he asked. With a grim expression, the general replied, "It's pretty bad, sir. The hit on the business park was made by a Russian Spetsnaz team. They drove a bus to the one building that housed our cyber warfare analytical cell and blew it up. EOD estimates the bus to have been packed with probably close to 15,000 pounds of high explosives. They're still putting out some fires and sifting through rubble as they continue to search for survivors. But presently, It's looking like around 1,740 people were killed. Probably around twice that many were injured. Powers shook his head in disgust. Was there anything we could have done to prevent this from happening? He asked. Letting out a short sigh, General Tibbets replied, Yes and no. I mean, we could have closed off the business park and essentially turned it into a controlled military facility, but it wasn't designed for that, so it would have created a disorganized jumble when people tried to come to work. There weren't specially built entry control points like we have on a military base to accommodate people coming and going. The general paused for a second as he searched for what to say. Since 9/11, the DoD's had to outsource a lot of our missions to various government contracting companies. The scope and scale of the intelligence mission, data collection, and analysis of said data was just too big for us to handle on our own, so we outsourced it. We could scale up or scale down depending on our needs at the time. It made economic sense to do so. The problem was it also meant we had a lot of important work being done at facilities that aren't nearly as hardened as some of our critical military bases. Jumping into the conversation, CIA Director Marcus Ryerson added, During the Cold War, the Russians had specialized Spetsnaz teams operating inside the U.S. and NATO countries that had trained to carry out this exact type of operation should a war break out. I think we grew a little complacent over the years and failed to account for the fact that they probably still had this type of operational capability within our borders. I recommend that we task the FBI and JSOC to specifically hunt down this unit and any others that might be out there. FBI Director Polanski nodded in agreement, and so did General Tibbets. Okay, make it happen, gentlemen, Powers ordered. He took a deep breath and let it out. Now let's switch topics and talk about this force down in Cuba. What the heck is going on down there? Signaling for a slide to be brought up on their shared screen, General Tibbets explained. The Russians have been busy using their transport ships to move a lot of Venezuelan troops and military equipment to Cuba. Although most of their equipment is old and outdated and these soldiers are poorly trained and led, they can still kill and cause us some problems. We believe they're gearing up to try and land some ground forces in Florida or the Caribbean to try and stir up some trouble. They know most of our combat forces are in the Midwest and Northeast. With the Chinese looking like they're going to invade through the Southwest, we've unfortunately left the coast of Florida and the Caribbean wide open. If that's the case, what are we doing about it? Asked Powers. Admiral Chester Smith had stayed silent, but jumped into the conversation at this point. We've moved several of our submarines to a few positions around Cuba. They've been given orders to pretty much sink any ship they come across that isn't American. We also moved a small task force of 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers and 3 destroyers to the Gulf of Mexico. They're going to work with the Coast Guard and either clear or sink the remaining freighters still in the Gulf. We've been slowly and steadily hunting down those merchant raiders that hit us during the first day of the war. That task force in and of itself is more than enough firepower to prevent those forces on Cuba from being able to cross the straits to Florida. We'll keep them bottled up and useless on Cuba. Smiling, the acting president responded, Thank you, Admiral. One less thing to worry about. General Marcus, the Air Force Chief of Staff, interjected. The ground forces on Cuba aren't the real problem, Mr. Vice President. It's those SAM nests the Russians built up across the island. They make it nearly impossible for us to carry out any sort of air operations across Florida, southern Georgia, and the rest of the Gulf Coast. We need to retask some of our air assets from up north to deal with this threat, so we can regain our freedom of air movement. Powers grunted. He knew the Air Force had been annoyed at him for not allowing them to marshal the needed air assets and bombers to go after the Cuban SAMs. While it was an enormous inconvenience not being able to effectively operate aircraft across the southeast and Gulf states, the more significant threat had been in the northeast. Not to mention there had been a considerable need to support the 4th ID in the upper Midwest. However, with the 4th ID now on its way to victory, it might be time to finally deal with this problem in Cuba. Looking at General Tibbets, Acting President Powers asked, "General, do you believe you can detail off enough assets to deal with the Cuban threat without disproportionately affecting our ground operations in the Midwest or the Northeast?" There was a short pause as the general assessed the situation. "I'll get with General Marcus and we'll figure something out," he replied. "We can probably spare some of the air assets he'll need for a few days, but not much more. I don't know that we'll be able to fully remove the SAM threat on the island, but we can probably reduce it." Powers nodded. "Generals, what I'd really like to focus on right now is figuring out what we're going to do to stop the enemy from capturing more of the Midwest," he said. "Are we going to be able to stop them from capturing Indianapolis, Columbus, or Pittsburgh?" General Pruitt chimed in. "We sure as hell are, Mr. President. The 35th Infantry Division, one of our National Guard divisions, has finally advanced into place around Columbus. They're going to start moving to contact later today. The 36th Infantry Division has just made contact with the enemy around Indianapolis. They're linking up with elements of the 101st Airborne and the 1st Cavalry Division. Their added firepower and tanks will be enough to stop these two German-Dutch divisions that have been giving us fits. As for Pittsburgh, we've repositioned the 82nd Airborne near the city, along with 2 brigades from the 42nd Infantry Division. Now that we have air support, we're going to start making short work of these Russian airborne brigades that were trying to make a move on the city." Interrupting the general, the acting president asked, "Isn't the 42nd Infantry Division from the Northeast? Didn't most of those units desert us?" Pruitt grimaced at the question. "Yes, sir. We did lose roughly 20% of the division due to desertions. This is a National Guard division, so a lot of the folks in these divisions have loyalties to their state and communities. I had doubts about the division prior to the surprise attack on D.C., but after it became known that the president had been killed, along with more than 200 congressional leaders, the remaining soldiers rallied to defend their country. I'm confident they will remain loyal, and they will fight to liberate our country." "If the generals are happy with their loyalty, then I won't second-guess them," thought Powers. "Okay, gentlemen, let's continue with the rest of the brief then." Secretary of State Haley Cagle, who'd only been brought into the PEOC that morning, cleared her throat. "If I could speak, Mr. President, I think I may have a solution to our problem with the Chinese forces on our southern border." While the acting president was stuck in the PEOC, the Secretary of State had been picked up by one of the looking-glass planes and had been circling somewhere over the country now for 2 straight days. They'd done several mid-air refuelings to stay aloft. If the war continued to stay conventional for another 24 hours, then they'd look to stand down the looking-glass and Tacoma missions. "Okay, Haley, what's your idea on how to handle China?" Powers inquired. Smiling, Haley leaned forward in her seat. "India. That is how we handle China." Powers raised his right eyebrow. "You're going to need to be more specific than that, Haley." The generals looked perplexed as well. Then General Pruitt smiled mischievously. "What do the Chinese fear more than America?" he asked rhetorically. Secretary Cagle nodded. "The Chinese are obviously looking to supplant us as the global hegemon by attacking us and participating in this global conspiracy," she explained. "They don't care about democracy or whatever crap General Secretary Baer is spouting off about. They just care about removing us as a Pacific power and as a threat to their 2049 plans. The only other country that can threaten China is India. Over the past 30 years, the population of India has doubled. They've now outpaced China in population because they never had a one-child policy. They aren't facing a critical shortage of women for the hundreds of millions of young men coming of age like China is right now. General Pruitt interjected. The Indians also have nuclear weapons and the fifth largest army in the world. I think the Secretary is right. If we could get the Indians involved, it could cause the Chinese to pause. Smiling at the compliment, Cagle added, That's exactly what I'm saying, sir. If we can get the Indians to come to our aid, to pose an immediate threat to China, we could potentially get the Chinese to back off. Acting President Powers steepled his fingers as he looked down at the table in front of him. This is an interesting proposal. It just might work, he thought. He returned his eye contact to the Secretary of State. Okay, Haley, you've sold me on it. So how do we get the Indians to agree to this? He asked. Before she could respond, he added, Also, one other question. Suppose we do get the Indians to go along with it, and the Chinese do back down. Do we really believe they're going to pack up and move their 2 army groups back to China from Mexico and Central America? I don't know how we can get the Chinese to pack up their army and go home, but I believe we can work out a deal with the Indians, Secretary Cagle replied matter-of-factly. Admiral Smith chimed in. The Chinese force in Mexico will, in time, be completely cut off from their logistical support system. When that happens, it won't take them long before they run out of supplies. But they could just live off the land and the local economy, Cagle responded. Central America has enough resources to support them, plus a few friendly nations in South America could continue to supply them. Sure, with food and fuel, not munitions, General Pruitt admitted. But if they opt to fight, they'll run into the same situation the UN force is about to in another week. They're all going to run out of ammunition, and then they'll be toast. So that brings us back to India, interjected Powers, trying to regain control of the conversation. What are we going to offer them that will get them to want to risk a war with China? It's not like we can assist them militarily in that endeavor right now. General Pruitt shook his head in disagreement. That's not entirely true, Mr. President. The Chinese have committed their Navy, Air Force, and ground force to this UN mission. The bulk of their Tier 1 combat power is in Mexico and Panama, not in mainland China. They're currently about as weak and vulnerable as they've ever been at home. This is perhaps the one and only chance the Indians will ever have at truly being able to threaten the Chinese in any meaningful way. We could encourage the Indians to make a move on Tibet or some of their other territorial disputes if the Chinese don't withdraw from this fight. Leaning forward in his chair, General Marcus, the Air Force general, added, I think we should go one step further, Mr. President. We should threaten to use tactical nuclear weapons on them if they don't withdraw. Powers did a double-take, and so did a few others in the room. You can't be serious, General Marcus, he remarked. The situation isn't bad enough that it warrants us using nuclear weapons, is it? General Marcus held a hand up. I'm not saying we should use them on our own soil or in Mexico. Hear me out, he said. Then he rapidly pulled up a map of mainland China and pointed to a particular spot on it. General Pruitt recognized the position immediately. You can't be serious, he retorted. That would devastate their country. Powers looked back and forth between the two generals, perplexed. He didn't understand what they were talking about. Secretary Cagle jumped back in. He's proposing that if the Chinese don't back off and leave this UN force and go home, we'll nuke the Three Gorges Dam. Powers crinkled his forehead in surprise. How would that help our cause if we did that? He asked, almost sarcastically. General Tibbets took up the answer. It would flatten a large portion of their military that's stationed in the region below the dam, but more importantly, it would devastate the city of Wuhan. Wuhan is like their version of Silicon Valley. It's also home to several of their defense manufacturers, including one manufacturer that's responsible for producing the microprocessors used in nearly all of their missiles. Destroying the dam would wipe out a huge part of their defense industry, in addition to probably 4 or 5 divisions worth of troops and equipment. The loss of life would be catastrophic, though, Cagle interjected. I'm not sure it would be worth the political fallout it would create. With all due respect to Secretary Cagle, the invasion of the upper Midwest is already devastating our economy, General Pruitt countered. If the Chinese open a second front in the Southwest, they could gut our country and further destroy our own economy. This isn't the 1980s. We don't have a multi-million-man army that can fight and win on multiple fronts. We have to pick and choose where we deploy our forces. You're advocating for the killing of probably more than 10 million people, General, admonished Secretary Cagle, her voice rising to a near yell. And if these Chinese open a second front, we may lose the entire war, General Pruitt retorted angrily. We may lose the entire country. It won't matter that we spared a few million peasants in China if we lose our nation in the process. No, I'll gladly sacrifice 10 million Chinese if it means we hold America together. That's not your call to make, General. Powers shot back. It's mine and mine alone. Acting President Luke Powers shook his head. He needed time to think about this. He couldn't just unilaterally decide the fate of millions of people like that, even if they were the enemy. The room grew quiet as all eyes turned to look at him. After a moment, he looked up at Secretary Cagle. Pursue something with the Indians. Let's see what kind of bargain we can strike with them. And let's tell the Chinese that if they do invade, we won't rule out the use of tactical nuclear weapons on their army. The generals sat a little taller in their chairs at that comment. Secretary Cagle nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. I'll reach out to the Indians and see what we can work out. I will also speak with the Chinese foreign minister and convey the potential threat. North Atlantic. Vice Admiral Paul Totten stretched out his back as he surveyed the scene before him in the CIC of the USS Gerald Ford. He had wanted to spend a couple more days amassing his naval forces before he made his move to deal a decisive blow against the UN naval forces. But after the attack on Washington, D.C., and the apparent dire situation on the ground, he'd been ordered to attack ahead of when he wanted to. Despite the loss of the Truman and the George Washington still undergoing refueling and a complex overhaul, Task Force 100 was still comprised of the carriers Eisenhower, Lincoln, and Ford, more than enough combat power to deal with the joint European-Russian naval force sailing toward the U.S. East Coast. With 18 destroyers and 6 guided missile cruisers, along with over 24 submarines, Admiral Totten felt reasonably confident of enforcing a blockade of North America. Soon, his ships would be in range of their Tomahawk cruise missiles. Then they'd let the subs advance and finish them off. If anything survived that onslaught, they'd handle them with their aircraft. For now, the doctrine of the day was stay at arm's length and rely on the Navy's strength, its Tomahawk missiles and its fleet of attack submarines. Captain Rory walked up to him and got his attention. Admiral, the enemy fleet is just past the tip of Greenland. They'll be in range of our missiles shortly, he informed him. Very well, Captain. Send a message to the fleet that they are to begin engaging their assigned targets as soon as they're in range, replied Totten. Any further ASW reports? Captain Rory nodded. Yes, sir. The Mitcher got a probable hit on a German sub, roughly 100 miles in front of the enemy fleet. The Forrest Sherman believes they have a probable hit on at least one Russian sub. They're still working out what class, but based on its noise signature, they say it's definitely Russian. Admiral Totten grunted at the report. I knew they'd advance with their subs in the lead, he thought. It's a good thing we didn't take the bait and try to get in strike range of our aircraft, he said with a half-smile. It would seem so, sir, Captain Rory replied with a smirk. It was their best option, hoping we'd come charging right into their submarine trap so they could spring it on us. Tell the destroyers I want them to keep up the good work, Totten said. Find and sink those enemy subs. We can't lose another carrier to one sneaking past them. Also, any word on the possibility of more merchant raiders? That last group kind of caught us by surprise. Captain Rory shook his head. Not yet. We spotted a couple of suspicious freighters a few hundred miles away, but they check out. The last satellite pass over the area doesn't show any freighters within a 400-mile perimeter of the fleet. If more missiles are headed our way, we'll have plenty of warning. Admiral Totten walked over to the digital map display on the side of the wall. Arrayed before him was a massive fleet of American warships and a joint European-Russian fleet. In the next 10 minutes, the first salvos of the Second Battle of the Atlantic would begin. The winds around the USS Vicksburg had finally died down a few hours ago, and while it was still cloudy, it appeared the worst of the winter weather had moved on. The seas, however, continued to churn, creating some deep troughs and swells that were going to make it challenging for them to carry out their upcoming mission. Captain Ian Troy called out to his weather operator. Chief, any idea on whether these crappy seas are going to level out? We're going to have to delay our attack if it doesn't. Chief Ailes turned to look at the captain. Yes, sir, I was just sent the latest weather report from the Ford, and it would appear we'll be dealing with some rough seas for at least another 20 to 30 minutes before things will start to calm down. I suspect the Ford will send out a message shortly, postponing the attack until we start to hit some calmer seas. Frustrated at the news, the captain grunted. Very well. Keep me posted of any changes. Getting up from his chair in the CIC, Captain Troy figured he'd make his way to the bridge. If things weren't going to happen for a little while, then he wanted to get out of that dark, cramped room and go check on the bridge crew. As soon as he entered the bridge, Captain Troy realized that the crew was alert but also apprehensive. They had their flak vests and helmets nearby, ready to don at a moment's notice. Two of the seamen had their binoculars out and were actively scanning the horizon and the waters around the ship between the rising and falling of the waves. Many of the crew knew sailors on the Truman and the Stennis, along with the other destroyers that had been damaged or sunk during the first day of the war. Things were personal. In the last week, the Navy had had more sailors killed and wounded in action than they had since World War II, a fact that wasn't lost on the crew of the Vicksburg. Morning, Captain, said one of the petty officers. Morning, guys. How's everyone doing this morning? Asked Captain Troy. Most of them responded that they were doing well. Some said they were nervous, but itching to get this fight going. They all knew they were supposed to start attacking the UN naval force soon. They just hoped they'd be the ones getting in the first punch this time. 20 minutes went by in relative silence. Everyone did their best to stay alert and keep busy in front of their captain as he sat silently brooding in his chair, waiting for the seas to calm so they could initiate their attack. While the supercarrier might not feel the effects of a turbulent sea, their guided missile cruiser sure did. Trying to launch a salvo of cruise missiles in 20-foot swells was not the best idea. They'd wait until things calmed down. It wasn't as if the enemy wasn't stuck dealing with the same weather they were. Eventually, the size of the waves did begin to shrink. Steadily, the seas were starting to calm as the winter storm traveled further away from them. What crappy weather to wage a war in, Troy mused. One of the petty officers, who was manning a communications terminal, suddenly called out, "Captain?" Troy walked toward the young man. "What do you have for me?" he asked. The young sailor held out a printed message from the Ford. Grabbing the paper, Captain Troy promptly read it over. They had a slight change in their orders. Now, they were to hold off on attacking the enemy ships for 2 hours until the seas had more fully calmed down. The Admiral wanted the fleet to launch their attack as a united front and not individually. This way they could more effectively overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond to the attack. "Send a message back," Captain Troy told the communications officer. "Orders acknowledged. Standing by to begin attack." "Yes, sir," the petty officer replied. Troy turned to look at the bridge crew. "Well, boys, it looks like we're on hold for at least another 2 hours," he announced. "Stay alert, but you all can breathe a little easier while we wait for the seas to continue to calm." Looking at his watch, Troy saw he'd been awake for nearly 12 hours. He hadn't slept well, tossing and turning, so he'd given up on sleep and toured the ship. Then he'd spent a few hours talking with many of the sailors and just checking in on them. When the attack was initially delayed, he'd figured he would stay awake for a while. But now that it was going to be at least 2 more hours, he decided to head back to his stateroom and lie down for an hour. Before he headed back, he got the attention of his XO. "I'm headed back to my quarters. Wake me in an hour, unless something important happens." "You got it, Captain," replied the XO. When Captain Troy entered his cabin, he made his way over to his rack. He took his shoes off but kept his blouse on, staying in uniform while he stopped for a quick cat nap. Being a ship's captain, he had to take little bits of sleep when he could. As he drifted off, Troy's mind began to race. He had this horrible vision that his ship was under attack by a swarm of cruise missiles. He kept yelling to his crew to engage the enemy missiles, but everything they threw at them either missed or didn't stop them. They kept closing in on his ship and his crew. Just as they were about to hit his ship, he was startled out of sleep by the buzzing sound of his phone, which was right next to his bed. He swung his feet off his rack to allow himself to sit up, then felt his forehead. He had been sweating profusely. The phone continued to buzz as he shook off the nightmare. He hit the button to pick up. "This is the captain." "Sorry to wake you, sir," said his XO apologetically. "We just got a message from the Hello. They have a probable underwater contact, bearing 324, 46 kilometers from our current position." "Whoa, that guy is close," thought Captain Troy. "Thank you for waking me up, XO. I'm heading down to the CIC now. Have the helm steer us toward that contact. Get our other Hello airborne to go assist them in locking down his position, and alert the other DDGs of what we found." With his initial orders given, he hung up the phone and slipped his feet into his shoes. Then he walked over to the water basin. Turning it on, he cupped his hands to collect up some of the cold water. He splashed his face a couple of times to rinse the sweat off and wake himself back up. As soon as he dried his face with the hand towel, he headed out the door to the CIC. As he made his way to the nerve center of the ship, he could tell by the lessened rising and falling of the ship that the seas around them had really calmed. Amazing what 20 more minutes can do, he thought. When he walked into the darkened CIC, Captain Troy saw several people standing next to the underwater threat desk. He made his way over and a few of them cleared a path for him. "What do we have, XO?" "They think it's an Akula," said his XO. "They are moving the dipping sonar now to try and get a better bead on him." His voice was low and tense. "Are there any other underwater contacts?" Troy inquired. "The Russians like to operate in wolf packs. If there's one, chances are there are others nearby." The tension in the room increased palpably. Before anyone could answer the captain's question, one of the lieutenants flagged him down. "Sir, the Porter and the Laboon are moving to our position to help track this guy down. They're sending their Hellos over to help as well," he explained, relaying some message traffic. Captain Troy nodded, then leaned down next to the petty officer manning the underwater threat desk. "ST-1 Klein, if this is an Akula, what's the effective range of his torpedoes?" The sonar technician thought about that for a moment. As an ST, he was supposed to be the resident expert on underwater threats. He, along with 4 other STs on the ship, was responsible for assisting the captain and the crew in identifying and prosecuting any possible enemy submarines. Klein's forehead scrunched up a bit. He's already in range. The Akula has 4 533mm torpedo tubes and 4 650mm torpedo tubes. The 533s are wake homing torpedoes with a range of 53 to 62 kilometers, depending on how fast they're going. The 650s have a range of 50 kilometers if they cruise at maximum speed. It was clear that Klein felt pretty proud of himself for a moment, as he almost instantly recalled the details of the Russian weapons capabilities. But that abruptly soured when he saw the looks of concern on the faces of those around him. They were well within range of those torpedoes, and that was definitely a bad thing. In the game of anti-submarine warfare, the goal is to keep the enemy subs outside their weapons range. When 2 boxers with unmatched arm lengths compete, the guy with the longer arms can prevail as long as he doesn't get in too close. The Russian sub had a shorter reach, but now they were well within their weapons range and in grave danger. Captain Troy turned to look at the Hello commander. "Tell the Hellos to engage the contact, now," he ordered. "I don't care if they don't have a solid lock just yet. If they drop a torpedo where they think he is, and he is in fact there, that sub'll spin up his engines to try and get away. Then we can get a better lock on his location and get more torpedoes on him." The lieutenant, a Hello pilot himself, reached over and grabbed for the radio handset that would connect him with his boss, the lieutenant commander and senior pilot on the ship. He hastily relayed the captain's message. Captain Adrian Petrunen was feeling a bit anxious to get things rolling. He and the crew aboard his Akula had spent the better part of 8 hours trying to get into position to deliver a blow against the outer perimeter of the American strike group. When they'd come across a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, Petrunen couldn't believe his luck. At their stalking speed of just 6 knots, it had taken a bit of patience to get within range of their weapons, but their perseverance was about to pay off. "Torpedo in the water! Torpedo in the water!" shouted one of his sonar operators unexpectedly. "What?" Petrunen shouted. "Where did that come from?" "Sir, it must have been dropped from a helicopter or plane." "Helm, increase speed. I want us above 30 knots yesterday," Captain Petrunen ordered. "Create a knuckle and eject a noisemaker." Everyone clung to whatever they could to steady themselves as the Akula lurched to the side, creating a cavitation in the water that would hopefully confuse the torpedo. "Noisemaker away," confirmed one of the petty officers. Now that the cylinder had been released, it would spin and create bubbles and other noise in the water, which could draw the torpedo off its path. As soon as they'd completed their hard turn, Captain Petrunen screamed, "Get some distance between us and the noisemaker and turn to face the American warship." Once the sub had leveled out a bit, the captain turned to his weapons officer. "Engage the American warship now!" he yelled. "Yes, sir. Obtaining firing solution," the officer responded. A few tense seconds passed before he announced, "Firing solution obtained. Release 2 wake homing torpedoes and 1 of our advanced heavyweight torpedoes," Petrunen ordered. "Yes, sir," came the reply. Seconds later, 3 torpedoes were in the water, rushing toward the American ship. 2 of them would skim the surface and rush toward the back of the boat, while the third would aim for the hull. For a couple of minutes, their torpedoes sped off toward the Americans, and they seemed to have escaped the attack from the helicopter above. Just as Captain Petrunen was about to breathe a sigh of relief, he heard the sound of a helicopter's dipping sonar ping right off their hull. Petrunen swore under his breath. "Torpedo in the water! Torpedo in the water!" shouted the sonar technician. "This one is much closer." "Helm, create another knuckle and release a second noisemaker," Petrunen ordered, grabbing something to steady himself. This time, even though they broke in a new direction at flank speed, the incoming Mark 54 torpedo didn't fall for the trick. It blew right past the noisemaker and reacquired its target. "Sir, torpedo is still incoming," announced his sonar technician nervously. "Brace for impact! Brace for impact!" blared the warning alarm on the sub. Everyone aboard clutched to anything they could find as if it would miraculously stop the incoming projectile. However, seconds later, the entire Akula lurched forward, and many crew members were knocked to the floor. "Damage report," bellowed Captain Petrunen. "Sir, the torpedo hit the rear of the sub and fractured its outer hull. The inner hull is also damaged. We're taking on water." At that point, Petrunen knew they were in trouble. If they didn't do an emergency blow and attempt to get to the surface, there was a good chance they'd sink. "I'd rather save my crew than continue to race away at our current depth," he decided. "Bring us up," he shouted to his helmsman. The sub rapidly angled toward the surface, bringing them closer to the air above and a chance at survival. When the Akula was less than 200 meters from the surface, his sonar technician screamed, "Torpedo in the water! Torpedo in the water!" Before the captain could respond in any way, the new projectile had slammed into the bow of the ship. The sub's forward movement and its rise to the surface were violently blunted. "Sir, the hull's got a massive gash. We're taking on too much water." That was one of the last things Captain Petrunen heard. Moments later, the power to the sub went out as the engine room was submerged beneath the cold liquid. Then, the Akula began its long and slow journey to the bottom. ST-1 Klein still had his headphones attached to his head when he jumped up and shouted, "Torpedoes in the water! I count 3 torpedoes. Heading 221, 34 kilometers and closing fast. I estimate their speeds to be somewhere around 50 knots. Captain Troy reached for the phone that would connect him with the helm. "Bridge, CIC. Bring us ahead to flank speed, heading 115, he said before he hung up. "Deploy the Nixie," he ordered. "Should we deploy the Cat?" asked ST-1 Klein. The captain turned and advanced toward Klein. When he reached the sonar technician's chair, he leaned in and asked, "Do you really think that thing will work? It's failed all of its tests so far." Klein looked at the captain as he stuck his chin out. "I think it's worth trying, sir. 2 of those torpedoes racing toward us are wake-homing torps. The Nixie isn't going to stop them." Captain Troy cringed at the comment. He knew his sonar technician was right. The Countermeasure Anti-Torpedo, or CAT, as it was called, was still somewhat experimental. The system had been in development with the Pennsylvania State University Applied Research Laboratory since 2013. Thus far, it had been tested with mixed results. 3 out of 5 times it had worked, but the other 2 times it hadn't, which was the reason why it wasn't trusted among the skippers of the ships it was deployed on. Skippers generally liked weapon systems that have a proven track record of working 100% of the time. A 60% success rate wasn't exactly something you wanted to count on when your life depended on it. Looking at the young man, Captain Troy saw that Klein felt confident it would work. He sighed, then nodded. "Do it, but don't miss, Klein. We only have 2 of them." Smiling, Klein went to work. He spun the computer control system for the Torpedo Warning System, or TWS, up so it could guide the Cat to the target. As the computer system warmed up, he called out to one of his sonar techs near the rear of the ship. "I need you to get the TWS deployed behind the ship ASAP," he shouted. The TWS would essentially be dragged behind the ship as it searched for the Russian wake-homing torpedoes. When it found them, it would feed the targeting data to the 2 Cats, which would then be fired at the incoming threats. The challenge with the Cats was that they were small torpedoes themselves, built for the sole purpose of destroying the Russian-made wake-homing torpedoes. Like a ballistic missile interceptor, It was almost like shooting a bullet with a bullet. If the cats missed the incoming torpedoes, there wouldn't be a second chance. Considering the many failings of the system, the Navy had a self-destruct function built into the final product. The logic was that if the cat missed, then the sonar technician manning the cat could detonate its warhead in hopes that it might still be close enough to the enemy torpedo that it would take it out. It took Klein and the other sonar tech a couple of minutes to get the TWS deployed behind them, and for the initial targeting data to start filtering in. To their horror, the enemy torpedoes had closed the gap on them faster than they had thought possible. "Give me an update, Klein," demanded Captain Troy. "Sir, the enemy torpedoes are now less than 6 kilometers away and closing quickly," he explained. "On a good note, one of the torpedoes did go for the Nixie. Now it's just the wake-homing torpedoes we need to worry about." "That still leaves plenty of worrying left," Troy mumbled. The torpedoes had now positioned themselves behind the Vicksburg as they maneuvered in for the kill. The TWS had locked on to the incoming threats and fed that data to the two cats. As soon as Klein saw he had a positive lock on the enemy torpedoes, he shouted out, "Engaging enemy torpedoes now!" Captain Troy, along with everyone else in the CIC, watched as the cats shot out and went right for the enemy torpedoes. The first cat collided with its target and blew up. Cheers and hoots of joy rang out in the CIC at the first confirmed kill. The second cat was headed right for its target when all of a sudden the Russian torpedo made another zigzag in its race to hit the Vicksburg. This unexpected maneuver by the enemy torpedo enabled it to slide right past the cat before it could hit it. Klein saw in a fraction of a second what had happened and jabbed the self-destruct button on the cat. Praying it was still close enough to take the last enemy threat out, Captain Troy watched the explosion and geyser of water spring into the air less than 200 meters behind them from the rear-mounted CCTV camera mounted on the exhaust tower. Everyone in the CIC shouted with excitement and joy when they saw the explosion, believing it must have come from the destruction of the torpedo. Captain Troy held his breath as he waited to learn if the torpedo had really been destroyed. Just as he was about to join in the celebration, the enemy torpedo suddenly appeared on Klein's targeting scope. The torpedo was now less than 100 meters from the rear of the ship, and he had no more cats to fire at it. In that instant, Klein shouted, "Brace for impact!" The crushing, thunderous boom reverberated through the ship as the rear portion of their ship flew upward and then landed back in the water. The lights briefly flickered off and on before they completely went out. The blast had impacted near the engine room and the ship's power plant. Seconds later, the emergency generators kicked in and the lights turned back on. "Damage report!" shouted Captain Troy as he walked over to Klein. Turning to face the captain, Klein sheepishly said, "I thought we had that last one, sir." He hung his head low in defeat. It was his responsibility to protect the ship from an underwater threat, and he had failed. Before the lieutenant commander in charge of the ship's damage control functions could respond, Captain Troy looked down at Klein, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "You did all you could, Klein. You stopped 2 of those torpedoes from hitting us. This wasn't your fault." Klein nodded, but it was clear he didn't feel any better. "Sir, we're dead in the water," announced the lieutenant commander. "We've lost contact with engineering. The machine shop just phoned in and said the lower decks are taking on water fast. They tried to get over to engineering, but the corridor was flooding fast. They had to seal it off. Get more damage control teams to the rear of the ship. We need to seal off the lower decks and the rear half of the ship, or we're going to go down," the captain ordered. "Someone get a message out to the Ford that we've been hit by a torpedo. Tell them we sank a Russian Akula, but we're dead in the water and in need of assistance ASAP," Troy ordered next. He needed to get some help on the way. He knew his crew wouldn't last very long in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic in January. "Sir, I just got a message from the porter," announced the lieutenant, manning their comm system. "They're 5 minutes out from our position and coming to assist. The Laboon wants to know if they should head our way to assist or stay out on ASW patrol." Captain Troy thought for a moment. The Vicksburg had a crew of 330 sailors. They wouldn't all fit on the Porter if it came down to it. He looked back to his comms officer. "Tell the Laboon to make best speed to our position. If we have to abandon ship, I want to make sure our people aren't stuck in the lifeboats for any longer than is necessary." The next 5 minutes went by in a blur. Everyone did their best to handle the fires that had sprung up on the rear of the ship and seal off the various corridors and decks that were rapidly filling with water. "Someone give me a casualty report," demanded Captain Troy as he looked at the clock mounted on the wall. It was now noticeably slanted at an angle. They were taking on too much water. The rear of the ship was settling lower and lower into the water, pulling the rest of the vessel downward. Walking over to him with a clipboard, his XO showed him the numbers thus far. 38 were unaccounted for, another 43 listed as injured. Shaking his head, Troy looked at the XO. "I want our wounded picked up by the Hellos and transferred over to the Ford if they have the fuel and ability to do so. We need to start getting them off the ship ASAP in case we can't stop the flooding." The XO nodded and moved over to the comms section to start getting that going. Meanwhile, the captain walked out of the CIC and made his way to one of the lower decks. He needed to see the flooding firsthand and try to talk with some of the guys stopping it. As he traveled down a deck, Captain Troy heard a lot of orders being shouted. When he reached the bottom of the deck as he made his way down the next stairwell, he saw there was already at least 3 inches of water. Crap. If we have water on this deck, then it's already overwhelmed the other deck below, Troy realized. "How bad is it, Chief?" he asked one of the chief petty officers who had just finished shouting some instructions to one of the damage control parties. "Not good, sir," he admitted. "We're going to have to seal off the deck below. It's like each time we seal one section off, we discover there's another leak somewhere else that allows the water to get behind each of the sections of the ship we close off." "Did we get everyone out of the lower decks before we had to close them off?" asked Captain Troy. A look of frightened uncertainty spread across the man's face before he responded. "I don't know, sir. We tried our best, but the lower decks flooded so rapidly. We tried to compartmentalize them by sealing up that rear section of the ship from the bottom deck all the way up to here. Somehow, someway, the water found a way around those sealed compartments and flooded the next open section. I think the blast may have ruptured some of the water mains or the HVAC system, and that's how the water's moving from section to section." Captain Troy shook his head in anger and frustration. If that was the case, then there was little hope they'd be able to save the ship. The only way they could stay afloat was if they could successfully compartmentalize the leaks and seal those sections off. Once they got the ship stabilized, then they could work with some divers to see if they could get some of the outer holes sealed up and begin to pump out the water. While the captain was contemplating how to handle the situation, an explosion rocked the ship. Captain Troy grabbed for something to keep himself from falling. When he'd steadied himself, he grabbed for the phone near the ladder well and connected to the CIC. "This is the captain. What the hell just blew up?" he demanded. The officer manning the damage control section responded. "Sir, the fire on the rear of the ship helicopter hangar bay has spread to the ship's internal JP-5 fuel tank, and that's what exploded." While the damage control officer was explaining the situation, Captain Troy looked down and noticed the water had risen another inch on his legs. It would appear this added catastrophe was speeding up their demise. "Hold on a moment," he told the damage control officer. Then he turned to the chief, who was still standing by him. "Chief, that explosion we heard was one of the Hello fuel tanks blowing. It would appear the fire in the rear of the ship got to it somehow. Do you think it may have opened another hole in the ship?" he asked. The chief thought about that for a second. "I think so, sir. Those fuel bladders are placed between the inner and outer hulls of the ship. If one blew, then it probably just ripped another gash in the hull. If we weren't already taking on so much water, I'd say we could seal off the affected compartments and portions of the ship and sail back to port, but we're already in trouble as it is. Another large hole in the hull is beyond our ability to salvage. I can't believe my ship's going to go down before we even fired a shot off at the enemy, Captain Troy thought angrily. He shifted the telephone handset back to his head. Tell the XO to order abandon ship. We need to get as many people as we can off the ship before we go down. I don't want our people dying of hypothermia in the water because we waited until the very last minute to make the call. Send a flash message to the Ford that we're going down and ask the porter and Laboon to come fetch us out of the water. Having just given the worst possible orders a captain could dole out, he turned to face the chief and the damage control party standing near him. The water was still rising. Now it reached their knees. You all did what you could. Now it's time to save ourselves. Everyone, drop what you're doing and let's get to the lifeboats. 10 minutes later, Captain Troy sat in one of the lifeboats, bobbing up and down in the 5-foot swells, as he watched their home, the USS Vicksburg, begin to sink. The rear half of the ship, which was fully engulfed in flames, slowly slipped under the water, while the bow of the ship remained raised out of the water, slowly being pulled skyward as the rear of the ship continued to fall deeper into the water. It only took a few more minutes before the rest of the ship followed the stern beneath the waves. As the USS Porter came near their lifeboat, Captain Troy saw the sailors of the other ship on their deck, ready to help pull them aboard. For the sailors of the USS Vicksburg, their part in this operation was over. Now they'd have to find another way to get back into the action, to get their revenge. Captain Troy's only solace was knowing they'd sent that Akula to the bottom.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.